Here we go. Well, welcome back to the channel. I'm Rod. I'll be your host today. I'm here on the other God, that was awful, wasn't it? The Untethered Consciousness channel. My returning guest, Jonathan, is with me here today. Now, I believe you're in Thailand today, Jonathan?
Yes, I'm in northern Thailand in the city of Chiang Mai right now. Yes.
Yes, I've been to Chiang Mai a few times. All right.
Yeah.
So just to get people warmed up. So for those of you who haven't seen Jonathan's interview, I've got links to that in the show notes. He's had a near-death experience, but really you don't have to ask questions that relate to a near-death experience. It can be related to anything. We take all kinds of questions. We do our best to answer them. I've got a few questions for Jonathan as well, and it's we're just kind of going to open it up. So I'll just throw this up here. If you've got a question for Jonathan, just so I can separate questions from comments, just put a Q in front of it, and I'll answer that for you. And if you are just joining us, don't be a lurker. Let us know where in the world you're from. It's always fun to see where people come from. And if you're watching this on the replay, then you can even put that in the comments as well. So if you've watched from UK or from Africa or wherever you happen to be, just let us know in the comments. That way we know where people are coming from. So I'll leave that one on there for just a bit. Now, to get us started, Jonathan, I had one question that I didn't get an opportunity to ask you the last time that we spoke. So it was when you had your near-death experience. So when you kind of had this choice of like, oh, I'm going to continue on to death or the other side, or I'm going to stay here because you felt like there was things that you still had left to do. Have any of those things become clearer to you since that time, or do you still feel like you're discovering what that mission is?
You know, that journey of discovery has gone on and on. At the time that event took place, which was a long time ago for me now, at 29 years old, I knew, like many people, many listening to this right now, that where my life was at that moment felt a little off. And that was about the clearest I could get to. I just knew this wasn't quite right. There had to be more. And it was going to take me quite a while to unpack that. And I feel like that's a question that I still unpack to this day. But the shortest answer to your question is those things did eventually become clear as well. Although in my case, it really took about an entire decade. You know, I think it's sort of a continuum of feeling at purpose in this world and in this life. And there have been times when I felt like I was way down here on one end of the spectrum, just floundering around, and other times kind of moved a little away from that into kind of know what I'm doing. And then there have been other times when I felt really tremendously purposeful. And so it has gone back and forth in a kind of a spectrum way like that. But I do feel as though increasingly, as I listen to that inner prompt and listen to that kind of inner guidance, that's the core inheritance of that listening, is moving closer and closer and closer and always closer to that sense of being at purpose. So,
yeah, I've spoken to a lot of people who've had near-death experiences, and you know, I think some, especially kind of quite close to, you know, after they've had that experience, and depending on what they experience on the other side, some people had these really profound things, and a lot of people have said, I did not want to come back. I can remember one guest, he was struck by lightning in a phone booth, and he was immediately like ejected from his body. But you know, after that, the place where he went to, when he knew that he was going to have to go back, it was almost like it wasn't, it felt like at the time it wasn't completely his choice, although I think sort of deep down he knew that was the right thing to do. But he really was like, no, I don't want to go back. You know, he was like in his 60s, and he felt like he'd achieved like a lot of things, and he was pretty happy to be in this, you know, amazing place. So did you ever, you know, second guess that choice in the months or years after, especially when you're just back in ordinary life?
No, I really didn't second guess it. It was clear at the time, and it continued to be clear. And when it would, you know, when I would waver in that sense of purpose in life in general, it was only because I had that internal feeling that I was a little off track and just needed to get back on track. So it was, and I would I would hasten to add that that was something that had been with me well before the NDE too. I think even as a young person, as a kid, I was asking in very privately, internally asking myself questions about purpose and like, what am I doing here and why are we doing this and things like that. And that had been a question that had been percolating with me for a long time, even by the time I got to be 29 years old. So it was not a new kind of question. It was just that it was presented in a context that was wildly new, but not a new question for me to ask of myself. What am I doing here? Yeah.
So one of the things that you mentioned in our last conversation was about how pain and suffering stem from a misuse of the mind. So have you, since that time, have you encountered any sort of, teachings or traditions or texts that kind of confirm that realization for you, or that help, a framework that help you deal with that?
Yes, I certainly have. So, I mean, as far as texts go, and I do not consider myself a scholar. I am not, and I don't, I didn't seek or grow up around a kind of tradition or particular teachers or anything like that. And it was actually many years after the NDE experience, and there have been some other experiences along the way as well that were quite meaningful to me. But running into A Course in Miracles and its particular flavor of non-dual expression helped me understand my own experiences better than any other source. And from that point, I began to see that there were other sources in the world as well that spoke to similar kinds of things, although the Course in Miracles does seem to have a very particular language and a very particular clarity to it that seems quite unique to me. But, the fact is that non-dual awareness and non-dual teachings have been with mankind for as long as mankind has been in touch with spirit at all, it seems. It goes back nearly as far as recorded history in some form or another in the human journey on this planet. It's not in itself new in any way at all. It's been expressed many different ways, many different times throughout history, regardless of culture or geography. But in this modern age, it was startling to come across the Course. And again, it was many years after the NDE, but it felt very confirming to me in a way that did help my own understanding continue to sort of settle and help me unpack it over time.
So how long ago did you discover Course in Miracles? When did you first run across that?
Sometime in my mid-30s, NDE at 29, and then, sometime halfway through the next decade. And I 6 or 7 years after that NDE, I didn't know the Course existed up until then. I had actually been reading, at the time, I had been reading a bit of the work of a gentleman named David Hawkins, who maybe you're familiar with, maybe your listeners are familiar with. He wrote a pretty powerful work called Power versus Force, was sort of his initial seminal work that had to do with muscle testing. He was sort of a pioneer of the muscle testing thing.
Oh, right. Okay. Yep. Like the body code, the emotion code. Is that the same guy or is it a different person?
I think that's a different person. But whoever that person was would have known David Hawkins' work intimately.
Yeah. I think that's where it evolved from. Yep.
Yeah. And so it was actually reading through something of David Hawkins, who was a powerfully, had powerful non-dual experiences of his own, that he put into his own language. He had been a practicing psychotherapist for decades. And he used a lot of that academic language to express his version of non-duality. And it was in his work that he made it a reference to A Course in Miracles. And that's what I kind of followed, that particular breadcrumb, and found the Course to be a very unique document. And, at this point, there are celebrated Course teachers all over the world. And I don't consider to count myself among them, but I cannot help often speaking and thinking in terms that I know that the Course would smile on.
Yep.
and that as it says in that work and in others as well, truth is just true. So there you go. And whether it comes through that particular book or forum or comes through another, it's there we have it. I find the language of the Course fascinating and sort of conducive somehow to my own style of thinking. And so I think sometimes when I speak, I do find myself saying things that I think a Course student would probably relate to, even though, again, I don't really consider myself specifically a Course teacher. I kind of feel like I'm doing my thing. And the Course is such a complete work. It's such a stunningly comprehensive work that I guess part of the reason I don't think of in terms of being a Course teacher is that the Course is such a comprehensive source in its own right. It seems right and reasonable to just let the Course speak for itself. And the idea of embellishing on it just sounds absurd to me, even though I love what it says. And so, as well as if I had to pick out another source from some of the historical times and places, I would pick something called the Ashtavakra Gita, which is sort of a slim little work that I've always thought was exceptionally charming and a little bit under the radar.
I've heard of the Bhagavad Gita, and I've not actually attempted that at this stage, but yeah, that's the first time I've heard of that one.
Yeah. The Bhagavad Gita is has a great deal in common with the Course. It has a similar, it comes from such a completely different cultural background and cultural milieu, so it speaks in a different kind of cultural language, but it says many of the same things in a way I find quite charming. And I'm not a scholar of that either, but it took many years to come across the Course. I was well aware of the Bhagavad Gita, but I never actually read it until about 2 years ago, just out of academic curiosity. I thought I might as well get to it, see what it actually says, and I just found it charming. Actually,
yeah. So for those watching who maybe have not, because I've attempted the Course in Miracles a couple of times, and I just couldn't get going with it. But I'll just show this on my screen. But there are a couple of others for anyone who's in that kind of territory. I'll just share these. This is my Kindle here. So the first one that I read was this channel text by Tina Louise Spalding, which is Jesus, My Autobiography. And that is a sensational read. So it's really a story of Jesus. And it's the first time, because I was not brought up religious in any way, shape or form. So I had no sort of context for really even who Jesus was. But that kind of is the story, whether or not you believe in channeling or not, I certainly do. But that was a really interesting read, which sort of gave me a whole lot more context as to who Jesus was. And the other one, also channeled by Tina Louise Spalding on the left, there's 40 Days, 40 Nights, which is more of a kind of a little bit more of a led course. So yeah, for anyone who's maybe had a go at the Course in Miracles, has heard that it's really good, but has kind of struggled to pick it up, I'd certainly maybe have a go at those two, and that might give you something to chew on that perhaps you couldn't get into before. And then I think if I hadn't read, especially this one, Jesus, My Autobiography, I don't think I would have wouldn't have heard of the Course in Miracles either, because I just wasn't even on my radar. All right, so I'll just a reminder to people, if you've got a question for either Jonathan or myself, then just throw that into the comments. And if you are just joining us and you're lurking, then don't be shy. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are from. So let me just see what else I wanted to ask you here, Jonathan. So there's this moment in our interview where you describe this dissolving of the individual self into an overwhelming allness. I think that you use those words. And is that ever returned to you in daily life, and not just as a memory, but something is a kind of a living experience?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yes. Um, yeah, it's, um, it went like this. During that NDE experience, it was sort of a full immersion of coming out of that NDE experience. As I described at the time we spoke, I essentially buried the whole experience in my own, for quite a few years, because I just couldn't figure out how to reconcile it. But a few years on, that experience began to sort of, it's almost like it sort of began to bubble up inside and would sort of show itself from time to time. And that was wildly unexpected in a sense. Like there would come these moments for me in which there was just, I just felt a sort of an unaccountable peace. And having come from a really quite a very chaotic background, that was something that was really notable to me, and was something that I had in fact sought in a way, but had never quite figured out how to return to in a way that was consistent or anything like it. The and that when those moments of peace would come, on one hand, it was confounding because I didn't have any sense that I had sort of machinated it or manufactured it or made it happen. They really were moments of real grace, and so if they came, I would feel grateful but a little baffled at the same time. And when it would sort of fade away, it felt like a tremendous loss that I lamented, and like, how do I get that back? And so that's one of the factors that began to drive this inner search, essentially, to unpack that, to understand that, to reconcile with it. And one of the aspects of that piece that sort of began to show itself more and more and more was that there was such a quietude at the center of it. And there came a point where I remember very vividly say, well, what is at the center of this? Where am I in this? And looking inward specifically for, like, literally, where is that I? Where is that? It comes, it goes. It seems like it's this aspect of me that is so powerful. It seems to, be responsible for everything about my world, like how I think and see and experience, and how I feel, and all. It's so powerful, and yet I began to ask that question of what is it, where is it, what's its nature, where does it reside? And I would literally I would ask myself these funny questions like, well, I feel like it's in here somewhere. And yet if I try to pinpoint it, like, is it in my fingertip? No, it isn't. And I began to realize things like, if I lost a finger, it wouldn't matter to that internal sense of I. That sense of I could see would still be intact. And that, a funny little thought like that arose somewhere in there, and it really kind of made something spark in me. It deepened the search. Like, well, wait a minute. If that's true, what else is true? And it sounds like a kind of a funny, almost macabre road to go down. But I thought, well, what if I lost that finger? No big deal. What if I lost the whole arm? And I'd think, well, that would be a bummer. But I could still see that internal sense of an I really wouldn't change. It would just be sad that its arm was gone. But the sense of I itself would somehow remain intact. And it began to put me viscerally in touch with that experience that had been so full in the NDE, in which it began to be intimately clear that whatever that sense of I was didn't actually have much of anything to do with this physical body. And so, and these things, I wish I could say I was some sort of spiritual savant, but when I look back and I realize how many years, like I just what I just described, I sort of wrestled with that for a few years, and it sort of had to unfold in that way. But those experiences of peace would sort of waft in, and I would be really naturally connected to senses and those ideas and those experiences, that sense of peace would somehow disappear, and I would be thinking, oh my God, I have a mortgage. What am I doing? I got to do more at work, and sort of generally freak out in all the normal ways that people worry about in this world. And that seems so radically far from that peace. And so it was that contrast was the kind of thing that continued to drive me inward to go like, well, then wait a minute, what's really going on here? What is really going on here? And so that question, and I did become aware that this turns out to be a very old classic question, that like, who am I? That's been being asked for, thousands of years. I didn't really know that at the time, but I began to be aware of that as well. So it's not like I'm suggesting that as a new idea. It's as old as, like nothing new under the sun here. It was new to me. And in that way, it was a revelation to me to continue to have my own attention directed inside and be faced with this contrast between the sense of I seeming very solid and very powerful. And yet when I looked for it, I couldn't find it. I couldn't put my finger on it. It was so ephemeral. I couldn't find any substance for it at all. And it's as though that began to sort of churn over and over inside me until it began to slowly break down, in the sense that I began to look inside and see that sense of self doesn't hold up. It began to be clear that it was actually a machination of mind itself. That this amalgamation of thoughts and emotions, which clearly were the result of thoughts, could be taken as a whole to have sort of created this sense of self, but that sense of self itself was extraordinarily ephemeral. It was, it's like the veil began to seem so thin, like there was not really any substance to it. And never mind the fact I'm operating a small business. I am in fact paying for a mortgage, having a relationship with a lovely woman, and doing all the normal things. And so that was also confounding. Like life started to seem extremely confusing, actually, because when one begins to really unravel and unpack and some of those things, it becomes very natural to begin to question absolutely everything. Well, why am I doing the things I'm doing? What is it that's driving those things? And it's the big things. It's life and career and relationships. And, so if you're going to begin to question the fundamental underpinnings of that self, it can't come as any surprise that you begin to question the most fundamental underpinnings of your life.
So do you think that that sort of remembering that wholeness, that is,
yes,
seems to me that's the reality of
yes,
who we are, in my view, although it's difficult to describe in terms of what our physical world, because that's all we have, or that's all we can, most of us can remember anyway. So do you think it's more, remembering that wholeness is more about letting go of the structures that, let me phrase it a bit in a different way. Do you think that spiritual awakening is about remembering that wholeness, or is it about letting go of the structures that prevent us from seeing it?
Well, I think that's a wonderful question, and it's certainly both. And I want to see if I can articulate a reason why both is so important, actually. There's a great deal of spiritual practices, a ton. There's so many in the world that will help anyone who pays attention to them begin to, quote unquote, break down what's not true. That it will help them begin to say, this isn't true, that's not true, this is an illusion, that's a dream, in ways that can be remarkable and powerful. And that is really, really deep, rich work. And it is the kind of work that tends to bring to people the kind of experiences that bring them to radically new places. But to get rid of things isn't actually purely enough, it turns out. Because to really come into a fullness of those kinds of understandings, seems to require not only that you sort of quote unquote get rid of what's not true, or see beyond it, rather, that's a better phrase for it. You see beyond what's not true. There has to be something that one sort of finds, experiences, realizes that replaces it. There has to be like, all right, if that's not so, then what? It's sort of like there has to be a place to go. If we don't find a place to go, then where we end up often, I talk to people about this a lot, is what a good Zen Buddhist would call being stuck in the void. And it can be both very freeing and also become something that seems a little dull and gray and lifeless. And it's when one lets go of what's not true and begins to be filled with the very, very simple essence of what is true, that some real fullness can come. And it's, a word like all-encompassing allness is a little poetic. But it's the other side of letting go of what's not true. If this isn't so, and that overwhelming allness comes flooding in, then there is this tremendous fullness that appreciates all that emptiness. But if it's emptiness alone, it can just end up being empty. And that's quite a mouthful, but maybe So
something to ponder on. I know that there was some things that we talked about that you haven't really discussed before, because I pressed you, and I'll do that again. Is there a part of your experience, either during your NDE or that collective pain episode, that you had that you've never spoken publicly about, that you'd be happy to talk about now, because it's just still, perhaps because it's felt too vast or too raw or too sacred?
What a nice question, man. I appreciate the question. Have I not spoken about it? That experience of feeling the collective pain of mankind was certainly overwhelming at that time that occurred. One of the things that I don't think I mentioned during our conversation was that that was an experience that I ended up returning to many times. And a year after that first occurrence, I encountered an experience of that again that laid complete waste to me. Like physically, I was a shaking, bawling mess, actually. And that it began to be something, though, that would appear sort of periodically. And it began to be interestingly clear that sense of collective pain was something that, how am I going to put this? Experiencing that many times in a row, or many times, just revealed in a very visceral way that my own, personal pain on a Jonathan level basis was sort of a proxy for collective pain, which was a proxy for personal pain. And it just sort of, they began to sort of collapse into sort of a difficult, there was no way to sort of differentiate in a way that, which was a very helpful part of that ongoing experience, because what it revealed was that transcending my own individual personal kind of pain was really the same process. It was no different than what was required for collective pain, and vice versa. I don't consider the experience of feeling the collective pain of mankind to be a particularly unique thing, because I find it impossible to look into the eyes of any other human being and not have some very visceral sense that same kind of awareness, that same connection is within them in some way as well, which can only make sense to me. I mean, Because that sense of oneness, which is on some level present with me all the time, and sometimes it's more in the background, sometimes it's more in the foreground, but I can't look at any aspect of the world and not sort of see both. Like there's an individuatedness to everything I look at, but there's also a way in which it's just a refraction of this whole. And so, of course, in every single one of those refractions, that whole is reflected. So that same collective pain that I might have experienced through this channel, I see it. I see it when I look elsewhere too. And I'm actually grateful that not everybody has to have that experience, because that would just be a bit much, like that. It's just not necessary for everyone else on the planet to have the experience of the collective pain of mankind. And that's something to be grateful for. But to your question, I'm sort of having a hard time answering your question, but I guess part of what I'm trying to express is that although it was another experience for me that was initially mind-bending and very powerful to me in my own journey, but at the same time, I don't think of it as being particularly special or unique. And I'm also grateful that it might be something that other people get to learn from without having to go through it themselves. That's a beautiful aspect of being human, and that we can do that. Don't actually have to be literally crucified to know what that's, to learn a lesson or two.
So have you ever had any sort of dreams or synchronicities or visitations that seem to connect back to that, that initial threshold moment?
Oh wow! No, not in the dreams department, but really more in just present, sort of daily life experience. Just sort of where there's such a quietude that I associate to that envelopment in that allness or that wholeness. Like one of the things that I described about that was that it's extremely complete, and if it's not missing anything, if it's really very whole and very complete, then there's no sense of lack or want or need. And if there's no sense of those things, then there's nothing to shout. Like there's no need to shout. And there really can't be any sense of fear. And if that's so, then it has the quality of something that's just in, tremendously peaceful. And so one of the things I would love to communicate to people is how the kind of revelation that might suggest that this entire perceptual universe is a figment, and that an underlying divinity is really the real truth, that can come across in a way that might be mind-bending and yet has a quality of quietude and peace that is so rich and so deep that one could encounter it and do absolutely nothing but want to quietly smile upon the world in a moment of silence and nothing else. And have that be so complete and so thorough and so rich in its completion that the idea of having to do anything with it, about it, or for it is absurd. And that can come off, I think there's a lot of folks that there are a lot of folks among us that sort of carry around the belief that unless they've had their mind totally blown, then they're probably not doing it right. Or something. Or if they're not having some radical experience that would immediately garner 1 million views on a YouTube interview, that they're not among the chosen few or something. And I would wish to communicate that some of the greatest, highest revelation a human being can come to could easily result in a moment of stillness and quietude and peace that is so rich in its own right that it's the quality of its extraordinary quietness that tells you of itself, not something that's full of fireworks. And these kinds of experiences can be all over the map. Sometimes people experience real fireworks, but it's not necessarily those fireworks that are the marker of what really moves the needle in someone. It's not necessarily the marker that says, oh, this is a big deal. It can be something so quiet that moves the soul, moves the mind, moves the awareness to precisely where it's best suited.
So just going, question I've got here, going back to, you said something about there's nothing that can be accomplished by fear that can't be better accomplished through love. So what's one fear that you've held on to the longest, do you think? What finally loosened its grip?
I can think of, it's funny, I'm having a hard time thinking of something quite specific because I can think of the feeling of what it felt like, but not the words that went with it.
And maybe it's something you haven't let go of yet.
Well, sometimes they still play, like it's another thing that is often on a bit of a spectrum. When 11 years after that NDE, when I went through a series of additional experiences that would often be called, awakening these days or something to that effect. And it was like the very literal experience of it felt as though something like 75% of all the fears I'd ever carried around with me just kind of blew away in the wind. And that is an extraordinary freedom, but let's be clear that means that there's a few of them that were sort of left behind in some residual form. And they would sort of play, and sometimes they still do. And the sort of attitude or experience I have when those do play is very different than it used to be, but it doesn't mean that they're entirely gone. And I think that's just a function of being a human on this planet, frankly. We don't get to be here without some sense of separation. Otherwise, we literally couldn't function here. And so some of the kinds of little fear patterns that crop up in me still sometimes include things like being concerned, like if I say the wrong thing in the wrong setting, that I'll just be too much of a weirdo and, sent into exile or something, which is essentially some form of an abandonment fear, and I can look at that and I can recognize it for being a silly non-truth, but sometimes it still plays. And so it's one of the great misperceptions that I think all of us encounter along the spiritual journey is that we assume that the mark of our progress is we are somehow perfected, and that is not a real thing on this planet in this dimension. That boy, if I was really healed, I'd never encounter this thing again. And I'm reminded of, I can think of many examples. The one I'm inclined to choose at the moment was, I think it was Alice Waters, who was renowned. She's been gone for a while now, but She was one of the great pioneers of doing trauma work with people, including, you know, severe cases of people that had been in concentration camps and things like that. I hope I'm anyway. And she herself had gone through some of those things, and there was an occasion when she was leading a workshop, and she was literally in her early 90s. Like, she'd been at it for her whole life. And she expressed to this crowd how, as much work as she has done, and she's done it all, sometimes those things would play in her too. And so it wasn't about her trying to get rid of them or push them away at that point or at that level. It was saying, yes, okay, even to that. Like, when those things would arise, she would let them arise and didn't have to judge them harshly, and didn't have to do anything other than just sort of let it arise, blow through her, you know, and then move on gently. And
that's kind of like anything you resist, isn't it? There's that thing about if you resist it, it persists. And
yes, very much so. So yeah, I think I encounter those kinds of things sometimes. I do, absolutely. Not nearly as much as I once did. It has a little different flavor than it did in the past. But yeah, sometimes things arise, but it's kind of like you let those go too.
Yeah. All right. Well, if you're watching this live and you've got a question, now's your chance. We're probably only going to be running for about another 5 or so minutes. So I've got another one here for you, Jonathan, which is, if you were to return to that moment during a near-death experience where you made that choice to either continue on in this life or go on to the next one, knowing everything that you know now, do you think your choice would still be the same? Why would that be?
I do. Yeah, I do. Absolutely. I think knowing everything I know now, I probably would have just been a little quicker on the uptake in saying yes and kind of getting to work, because I think I would understand the direction I was to go in a little more clearly. You know, one of the things I would say is that that I look back at my own capacity. On one hand, I would say that for me, sort of defining what the spiritual journey is most succinctly about, for me, it has been an increasing willingness and tendency to listen to that inner guidance and actually follow what it says. And on one hand, there are ways in which I feel like I've done that very well. I'm very grateful for that. But at the same time, I can see so easily and so clearly, certainly in retrospect, how often and how greatly I've dragged my feet as well. And I find that a bit inescapable. It's, you know, it becomes another one of those sort of forgiveness opportunities to just go, oh, well, here we are. And yes, I would make the same choice. I think I would make it even more joyfully. And I think I would probably get to work in the world here considerably faster and with more clarity and with greater depth. But I'll continue to work on that. So.
Well, I'm out of questions here, Jonathan,
All right.
and yeah, we've had quite a few people join in, but sometimes it's all about the replays. I try not to read too much into it, actually.
Good.
Look, I appreciate you joining me here today from Thailand. I'm for those of you just logged in, I'm Rod from Australia. So we talk about that question, which is, who am I, on our channel. So I wish you well, Jonathan, with what you're doing, and perhaps we might have you back on the channel. I'm not going anywhere, but maybe we'll have you back again sometime to have another conversation.
Well, I'll be delighted to do that. I can't think of anything better to be doing with my time than things like this. And
Excellent.
yeah, maybe one of these days soon, I'll even have a book for you. That's part of what I'm doing here, is to set aside time for the writing. So
yeah, well, that's definitely some of the reasons why I've said to people before, once you write your book, I'll definitely have you
Yep.
back on the show. Doesn't
Sounds
matter
good.
how we go. All right. Well, thank you for joining us, everyone who's tuning in. If you've watched this on the replay, thank you for tuning in as well. Just let us know where you're from, which part of the world you've joined us from. And I'll see you on the next interview or the next live stream on the Untethered Consciousness channel. Bye for now.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rod.